Yeah.
Yeah, I'll keep an eye out for it.
So are we, Haley, are we all set?
We're ready.
Okay. So Sharon's not here yet, so we, I think are not going to be able to take action until she gets here. But, so we'll hold off on approval of the minutes, and I don't see anybody here that looks like they're a bit public comment. So, um, so good morning, everybody. See everyone. We have a lot on the agenda today. The biggest of which is really two budget items, our amended FY 2022 budget and also approving the recommended FY 23 budget as well. Steve's going to give us much more of an update, but we did have some very good news in the governor's budget that was released back in December in the form of increased revenues and much higher revenue projections that are going to, I think over a 6-year period, result in about an additional, I think, $300 or $400 million towards rail, towards VPRA. As a result of that, we also have some budget surplus, unexpected budget surplus, I would say, for FY 22 as well. That and that's across the board in the Transportation Trust Fund, but also benefiting VPRA as well. So. But I will let Steve do the kind of talk through all of the budget assumptions. But do we have, is Rob Churchman here or?
Wrote me a little while ago and said he was having trouble with track. So I think we can, I don't know if we're going to approve the minute.
Well, we can't till Sharon gets here.
Okay.
Yeah, so we'll do that, take action when she.
Then let's just keep moving and when he gets here, I'll stop and
Great. Well, then why don't we go into the number 5, the 22 budget amendment. And that would be Steve and Shane.
yes. So as Jennifer said, we've got a lot of work to do today on the budget. Next slide, really, this is just the background of what the code says we do for the budget. I just want to point out, y'all, a lot of work went into what we're presenting today. I just want to thank Shannon, but also all of VPRA, every employee did a lot of work to get to this. As you know, we're doing an amendment, and it's a one-time event that we're going to do this amendment. It's a big reason is to get the Western Rail Florida program into the budget because that is moving forward. But also last year at this time, VPRA didn't have any employees, and so we had a very short window to put a budget together. And so we have a lot better information today, and we feel that amending the entire budget for 22 will, for the last 6 months of this year, give a lot better idea to y'all of what's going on with that. That being said, moving on to the next slide. This just really says why we do a budget. I'm not going to read that. The classifications of the budget, I do want to point out here that we have our operations budget, which is our administrative costs, but also our passenger services, which is the core of why the rail authority exists, to run that service. So that's what's in our operating budget. Our capital projects budget is expenditures related to projects that we will still own the asset and have to maintain the asset going forward. It sort of mirrors financial accounting perspective here. And then finally, what we call capital and operating grants, is where an outside party, one of our partners, they are undertaking the project and we're participating in a financial way and also maybe providing some technical advice too. But they're going to own that asset at the end of the day. So it might be a DRE platform improvement. Or it may be like for Roanoke Yard and Western Rail, we're going to have to do some improvements in the Roanoke Yard, go to Christian. They're going to still own those assets. So that's what the grants are. So those are the classifications of the budget. So if we go through, you'll see we're going to try to break the budget down into those three components to be able to get through this information. Next slide. So here, I talked about it being a one-time update. Also, I mentioned Western Rail to be included and better information. And I think the last thing I want to say here is, as we're going through the capital projects and the capital grants, capital operating grants, I think as board, you should focus on new projects that we've added, projects that existed that we're putting additional funding on, and then projects that have been removed from the budget or have been a budget review. And then as when Shannon comes up and takes you through these next two sections, I think one thing to remember, we're going to talk a lot about the FY22 budget amendment. When you get to FY23 proposed budget, the only thing that will be different from the amendment will be we're adding the fiscal year 28 expenditure plan. So the total, the actual total of all the projects, capital projects and capital grants will be the same FY22 amendment to FY23. It's just we're showing it the furthest out for the 6 years. We're adding FY28. And with that, I'm not going to continue talking unless there's questions from an overall perspective. And then I'll let Shannon come up and take it through the project.
And I did hear from Sharon, she is parking, so she should be here soon.
Awesome. So capital projects is where we're going to go next. So as Steve mentioned, this section of the budget is going to relate to projects where at the end of the day, we're going to put them on our balance sheet as fixed assets. We're going to own them. We're going to be tasked with maintaining them over their useful life. The capital project section really consists of two core programs. So you've got the I-95 corridor program and then the Western Rail corridor program. We're going to start out with the I-95 corridor program total budget, which you'll see here. What this slide is really trying to drive home is what Steve was saying. So the FY22 amended total budget is going to be the same for the 22 amendment and then the 23 budget as well. This is going to break out all of the changes that we're going to be discussing in the next two slides. The other thing to note is that the total budget includes all expenditures for all years. So we're going to be looking at the whole project in totality. Please pull this slide for me, Hazel. Awesome. So we're going to take a look at some of these changes here. So in green, I know it's a little hard to see, that first section outlined in green. These four projects were updated to align with the costs included in the executed CRA that was signed with CSX. So Long Bridge, the driver of this increase was the fact that it was originally going to peak up and the actual construction was going to start in 25 and 26, but that's been shifted out to 28 and 29. So the increase here relates to the time value of money with that shifting out of the project. The Alexandria fourth track increase relates to additional right-of-way that needs to be purchased for that project. Franconia to Lorton and Franconia to Springfield bypass. The change here relates to delineation of these projects. So there was actually a shifting of some of the costs, realizing that they had some overlap. So Franconia Lorton has increased, but the bypass has decreased for a net decrease of about $54 million. So that was a net benefit for us. The next item here highlighted in red is that we have transaction costs that need to be added to the budget. We were not really aware of the amount of transaction costs that go into such a purchase, so we need to be including them in our budget to track them. There's a lot that went into titling and legal assistance and a lot of survey work that we need to be accounting for, so that's been added into the amendment as well.
I would say probably a majority of it is actually related to surveys.
Yes, yeah, exactly. The last increase that we're calling out here is a gross up related to the Newington Bridge and the Route 1 Bridge. And the original budget and the approved budget, there was only the portion related to the PPRA funding included, so it was just a sliver of the total project cost. But because we're going to be owning the whole thing at the end, we want to put the total project cost in here. We've also added the funding as sources put on these projects as well. So that's why we're putting the whole grossed up amount for bridges in the budget.
So with those two projects, we also have funding from Fairfax County and VEDA. Those included those that wasn't.
Right, exactly. That's Route 1 Bridge, and then Newington Bridge, the other funding source for that is a grant with the FRA as well. So that's been added, and so we're kind of looking at that more and holistically for those projects. Maybe we could flip over to the next one for me. So this is the next amount of changes. Thank you. So as Steve mentioned, we're trying to do a better job of putting these these projects in the correct bucket in our budget. So this first one highlighted in yellow is the Amtrak new equipment. So this has actually been reclassified to a capital and operating grant. We are going to be giving this money to Amtrak to purchase 2 new train sets. We're bringing on new service. So this actually is going to be something that we're not owning, which would fit more of a classification of grant. So it's been moved down there and you'll see that in the next section. The Richmond layover facility. So this is the required project that we will need to do in order to meet the schedule defined in the CRA. So we've added it into our budget to make sure that we're able to track it. Next, we have Lorton to Route 1. Sorry, still on this. A lot of changes on this one. Lorton to Route 1. So Franconia to Lorton it's bringing that corridor up to 3 tracks. And then you have this Lorton to Route 1, where it's dropping down to 2 tracks. And then you have the Route 1 bridge, which is 4 tracks. So there's this 1.1 miles that's going to kind of essentially just kind of be a bottleneck still. So this is going to be developed in phase 3 and 4, but we'd like to shift it forward to phase 1 and 2 because it will gain not only development efficiencies, but also cost savings in the long run. So we do have the funds to do this. So we figured this would be a really great project to be shifting into this time frame. So that's why we've added into the budget for this year. The last item here is our other I-95 corridor projects. Everything in this budget relates to furthering our FTA full capacity grant eligibility. So additional requirements that we need to do to maintain our eligibility for the application we have in. We will not know if we receive this funding until we've passed through our design phase. So in about 2 years, but we need to continue to advance these specific items in order to maintain that eligibility. This is going to round us out on the I-95 corridor budget changes. Any questions I can answer at this time?
Let me just add to that. That's fantastic. Thank you, Shannon. We won't know if we get the core capacity money for at least a couple of years because we have to go through the process. Our current budget assumes we get $0. So we're not counting on that money. Right? If we get it, it'll allow us a lot of flexibility, but the budget does not assume we receive that money in.
Exactly. We are building out in our modeling, we're building out scenarios where that would come in and kind of the different things that would shift as a result of receiving that funding. So that's something that we're in the progress of doing right now. So fingers crossed we do get it. I mean, that would really open up some funding to put elsewhere in our project. Okay. We are going to move on to the Western Rail Corridor. So these are going to be the capital projects that are going to be added related to the Western Corridor program. So we've got the acquisition, the new platform and track that we're going to be developing. We've got some capital improvements that will need to happen. And then we've learned our lesson. We are putting transaction costs in. And the executive director's report, you've probably seen we've been incurring expenses related to this already as the transaction is kind of well underway. This is going to be the total amended budget for 22 and also the budget for track for 23, including all expenditures for all years. I will note that there's also some grants related to this. If you looked at page 7 of the FY23 budget, you'll see an inclusive list of both of the capital projects and the grants together for this program. Can I answer any questions on the Western Rail Corridor program projects that we'll be adding to the budget before we move on? Wonderful. Okay, so we have taken a look at the total project budget and we're going to kind of zoom in a little bit and we are going to look at the annual expenditures now. So at the top of the screen, we're looking at it from 2 lenses. So let's start at the top of the screen here. So we've got the amended 22 annual expenditures in comparison to the FY23 expenditures. Year over year, you're going to see a decrease of about $27 million, which is probably not what you want to see as your projects are really gaining steam in design and making sure that you're still spending that money and getting these projects moving. But what really is driving that decrease is that the right-of-way acquisitions that are occurring in 22 are not repeating in 23. So about $127 million decrease related to those. We are seeing that increase in expenditures on both programs, $73 million related to the I-95 corridor and $29 million related to the Western Rail Corridor. On the bottom of your screen, you're going to see a comparison of the amended 22 budget versus the approved 22 budget annual spend. What we're really trying to drive home here is you can see in 25 and 26, there's that big ramp up. That's the construction of Long Bridge that we had initially, we're going to do for Long Bridge before we kind of went through the CRA process and pushed that project out. But now you'll see that that ramp up is in 27, but 22 to 24, that really has stayed the same. So that's just what that's depicting there is the annual spend difference between amended and approved. Okay, we are going to move on to the fun part of how are we going to pay for all of these? So on the next slide, we have got our total funding for the $4.1 million capital projects budget that we just talked through. 4 big ticket items in here. We've got the I-66 inside the Beltway toll funding, VPRA revenue, CTB allocated VPRA, and then Amtrak capital contribution. The CTB allocated VPRA, So this is going to consist of items such as Smart Scale, CMAQ, I-81 revenues, and the PTF funds. This has increased since the prior year because we've added in about $155 million of revenue related specifically to the Western Rail Corridor. The other one we wanted to talk through on this one is the I-66 inside the Beltway toll funding. So this revenue source has taken a bit of a haircut, about $270 million. The last study that was done on this revenue source was done in 2019. Obviously, a lot has changed since then. Right now, we're using current estimates and the fact that we're operating in such an unknown environment. We don't know what's going to happen next. So the pandemic, our federal workers are going to be required to go back to work and increase that traffic pattern during that time. We do not know. So we're trying to make sure that we're taking a conservative approach so that we can still fund this in total. Luckily, with that decrease, VPRA fund revenues have increased to kind of put us back at a good level for our funding for these. But that's where we're at with the I-66 toll funding. We do hope that maybe there's a turnaround and we do see a lot more revenues coming from that source, but we're not sure.
And this is a mix of pay-as-you-go and bond proceeds.
You got it.
Yeah.
Exactly. The last thing on this before we move off of it is there are 3 different financing that we're going to do in order to fund these capital projects. We've got the inside the Beltway toll funding, which we've kind of just talked about. Oh, Sharon?
Yeah. Oh,
Okay.
sure. Oh, coffee's in the other room. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
All right, so the I-66 toll funding is going to have a financing component that's going to be led by VDOT and the CTV. We have the VRE CROC funding, which is going to be led by VRE and should happen in the next quarter or so. And then the one that the VPRA will be leading is the passenger ticket financing, hoping to do that around 2025. Okay, this is going to conclude capital projects. Anything, Steve, you want to add at this point? Or?
Well, I do want to say, talking around church, didn't give him good directions, I guess. He's at our home base, we're on 600 his name. Should be here shortly.
Okay.
Okay, moving on to capital and operating grants. So capital and operating grants are going to differ from capital projects in the fact that we aren't going to own the asset at the end of this development. We are contributing funds to a third party to develop their capital asset or run their operations. So we're only going to be giving a portion of a bigger project. So rather than looking at a total budget here, we're going to be looking at the VPRA grant funding, the portion that we are going to be passing through our financial statement controls. So there are 29 grants that we will be administering. 24 of them are VPRA managed, and there's 5 of them that are going to be DRPT managed. There's some drivers over here on the right-hand side that I'll walk through about the changes, and then we'll dive deeper into the specifics in a minute. But some of these changes are going to relate to changes in grantee project scope, CTV grant awards, budget reclassifications, new or removed VPRA grants, or just updated project grants related to VPRA projects. I'm going to note real quick. So 30% of these grants are CTV allocated, meaning that grantee is applying through the CTV process and they're being awarded there. And we're just administering the grant with a flow through of funds coming kind of from CTV sources. If we flip to the next page, Haley, so the other thing that we have changed this year is we've broken this down into 2 categories. So it's more clear. We've got the VPRA managed grants and the DRPT managed grants, as you can see on this page here. We have added in the DRPT managed grants because we are going to be paying for these. However, they are going to be managed by DRPT in accordance with the MOA that was board approved. We would like to add them into the budget this year because the funds for these are VPRA money. We have the cash for these, but in order for us to effectively cash manage, we need to know when these projects are expecting to pick up steam, when the cash is going to go out the door. Also, if these projects, say the grantee decides not to move forward with them, the funds revert back to the VPRA and they will be used at our discretion. So we want to make sure that we're accurately tracking these grants. So they've been added into the budget this year too. Before we leave off this page, I just want to draw everyone's eye to the $129 million change. We're going to go to another slide that really breaks down what's driving this change, just so you can understand what the increase is related to for these VPRA funding and grants.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Yeah. Somebody to keep you? No, that's okay. So we are right now going through the amended FY22 budget. And then we will be talking about the FY23 one. So, yeah.
Right. Yeah, we are talking about them kind of in conjunction. So everything for the total project budgets and VPRA grant funding is going to be the same for 22 and 23. So we're kind of trying to talk about it holistically here because The budget that leaves us at 22 is going to be the same budget that we're going to be using for 23.
Okay.
So here, Sharon, if you leave, we're at the bottom of capital and operating grants. We're talking about the changes impacting that from a VPRA grant funding perspective. So the first item here noted is the VRE scope changes in new CTV grants. So VRE gets many grants from the CTV. So all in all, they actually had a decrease of $31 million related to changes in scope, because now that the I-95 corridor is being developed, a lot of the projects actually didn't need to occur anymore. So that's what we're seeing there with VRE. The next four grants are really the VPRA grants. So we've got Ettrick Station State of Good Repair, Station Programming and Planning, Positive Train Control, and then S-Line Planning and Development. This is a total increase of $24.6 million. This is really VPRA fund money. So Ettrick Station and Positive Train Control, these increased related to more knowns about them. We have actual costs that we will be paying for these specific projects. So the budget has been increased to reflect that. And then Station Programming and Planning, that has increased just to continue our commitment to developing the state of good repair for the stations that we own. And then a small portion related to the development of the S-Line as well. Before we move on to that, I just want to note that Ettrick Station, we do have an application out for Chrissy grant on this. We do not know if we're going to be awarded it at this point, so the revenue funding, similar to the FTA grant, has not been included in our sources, but we are seeking funding to kind of mitigate that increased cost for that. The next section, we have our Western Rail grant. So we have the Western Rail Initiative grant and the Roanoke Yard grant that has been added to our grants budget this year. And then, like we already talked about, DRPT Managed has been added as well. So those are the new grants and additional grant funding that we're adding. In addition to the increases there, we've got some removed and reclassified grants. So you saw this up above. We have the Amtrak train equipment that has been moved from a capital project to a capital grant. It has also decreased. It was 55 million up there. It's now 34. We have a better understanding of how much it will cost to purchase those train sets. So it's decreased as well, added in as capital grant. The next two grants have been removed as the Western Rail Corridor Initiative grant has been added. So these are no longer relevant grants and they will not be administered anymore. So those funds are being redeployed. And then the track lease payment to CSX. So in accordance with the JOMA signed with CSX, this payment is actually going to be covering our right-of-way maintenance costs on the I-95 corridor, which is truly an operations cost. So that's been moved down to operations. So that's been reclassified out of grants as well. So it's a long-winded way to say we've got our $129 million increase, and these are the reasons why. Any changes on, or any questions on any of these changes that we've talked through here? Great, we'll keep on chugging away. Perfect, so we're gonna move on to the VPRA grant funding for capital projects. So as we mentioned before, 30% of this is CTV allocated, CMAQ funds, I-66 outside the Beltway concessions or smart scale. There's also going to be a portion that's CTV allocated to the VPRA. So this specifically relates to Western Rail. So this has been added because those funds are earmarked specifically for those project costs. And then the remaining amount is funded with VPRA funds. You're good. You're good. You can move on to the next one. Okay, last one, similar capital projects. We wanted to show the change in spend per year for the amended versus the approved. So you're going to see a huge jump in 23. $26 million of this relates to the Western Rail Initiative grant payment that's going to be going out the door that year. The other amount of this is really going to be that grantees expect that their spend is going to really increase in 23. So we go out to them in order to prepare this budget. We'll ask them when they expect their projects to pick up. So that's the other amount driving this increase in 23. So that's what we're reflecting here. This is the last part of the capital and operating grant section. Can I answer any questions on this? Perfect. Steve is going to pick back up and walk you all through operations now.
Thanks, Shannon. So that's, I'll just responding to our auditor. I guess he just said his daughter had called him and has some positive COVID case. So I'm going to try to rearrange him to come into the full board meeting later today and hopefully be able to do it on WebEx. Just, I don't know, some caution. So anyway, I just wanted to let y'all know that we'll put that on for this meeting and see if we can fit it in later. So I think it's going around. So on the operations budget, a couple of points here. We are gonna, the biggest change, and I think it's a really good change, and it kind of stemmed out of doing our financial statement. Here. We're gonna report the revenues and expenses at a gross level. So in the budget last year, when we did it last December, we kind of mirrored what we had been doing at DRBT, which was just paying a net bill, where they take our revenues and net it against expenses and send us a bill, and we were just showing the expense, the net expense. And now we're actually going to show a budget where we have the revenues and the expenditures, and that's all leading to one, better management purposes on those different trains we're running, and then two, and later on, as Shannon pointed out, we're going to do a ticket financing based on our ticket revenues, and so we really need to have a history of those past year revenues. That's the first point. Second point, there are several reclasses, as we've mentioned, to get different items that prior year we didn't necessarily have the classifications defined that well. So we had some things that were in capital projects that maybe should have been more of a maintenance related item in the operating budget. So there are some reclassifications. So for instance, in the slide we're looking at, there's the I-95 corridor maintenance way VRE access. So that's a reclassification from the capital projects budget last year. And the third thing I want to do before I jump into the detail, really, from an overall point of view, we added down here at the bottom what we're going to call a cost recovery rate. And this is at a macro level, so it's all our operations, including our admin. And over time, I think we want to set a metric that as an entity we're trying to achieve here. For now, with COVID and revenues and ridership of our trains, took a deep dive, and it's slowly been coming back, and then we've had these variants. It's made it a little difficult to establish that metric, but I think the next year or so we start to pinpoint on some history and come up with a metric that we're trying to achieve. And you'll see later. That same sort of concept, we are going to drill it down to each individual train from an operational standpoint.
And Steve, if I may, let me just add, our goal is not to be over 100%. And I think if we end there, that's fantastic. But from a business point of view, we understand that the role of passenger rail is to get people off the highways, get people on trains. That may not be a profitable endeavor in every single one of these routes. So I don't want folks to say, oh, look, they're all about money because we're all about getting folks on the trains while being fiscally responsible.
Yeah, I think good point, DJ. Every transportation mode is subsidized: roads, airlines, transit, etc. So I don't think we'll ever get towards even get close to 100% on cost recovery. But at some point here in the near future, we'll have a metric we need to say this is our goal.
Goal is continually, we'll be able to see that.
So next slide, please. So this is, I'm going to take us through the amendment to the FY22 operations first. Because of that change in the way we're reporting the budget from net to gross, it's not easy to just line both of them up down the page because we didn't have all the detail for a gross budget and the approved from last May. So these two tables will crosswalk you from that net from last year to the gross. So the table on the left here is essentially showing you the net and at a macro level, 51.2 million last year that was approved, and now we're amending that to $18.1 million net that has to be funded. The differences are $8.2 million of additional costs related to new service that was in FY22 in the approved budget, as we thought we were going to start new service during 22. That new service is now beginning this summer. So it's really pushed, it didn't happen in 22 at all, it's pushed to 23. when we did the budget last year, we had heard that there was going to be relief funding for the pandemic, but we didn't know the specifics. So we did not include any federal credits, which offset costs. So that was $10.3 million. Another item, we had included expenditures in the approved budget for a whole year of the Richmond service, and that service had been stopped and it didn't return until the end of September. So there's 3 months of that service that we now know we didn't have to pay for. And then the final difference is our revenues. We were probably just a little too conservative with the unknowns of COVID and our revenue estimation. So, and then over on the right, it takes you through the proposed amended budget and shows you the detail from a gross perspective with the revenues, expenses, and then the other operating expenses, getting down to that 18.1 that we're comparing at the net level on the left. As I'm talking, if y'all have any questions, please feel free to jump in. So the administrative budget for FY22 and the amended, it's a $1.47 million increase. The majority of that is the number of employees that we've moved from 28 in the original approved budget to hoping to be at 34 by June 30th. So that's the majority of the increase for the payroll. We also are utilizing the stand-up of our organization. We started, did not have any general ledger system, and I took a little while to even get payroll to work. So we're having to use a lot of outside support until we get staff hired. So we needed a little additional professional services to provide assistance. And some other things that we're doing with that assistance is we're working on federal grant applications for the infrastructure bill and the funds that are out there. And then finally, the last thing I'll mention here is the ERP and moving that forward now. And there's a slight increase there, which partly is the ERP, but it's partly just our underlying IT cost and having more employees by the end of the year. Next slide. Next slide. All right. So for the FY23 operations budget, you'll see that there is a significant increase. If you look at the table on the right, $50 million. So it's comparing what we're proposing as an amended budget to the FY23 proposed budget. And you see a $50.4 million increase. So I want to take you through what that is being derived from. So the first is, as mentioned a little while ago, the two things we thought that we're going to start in FY22, that are going to start in FY23. And if you average the 6 existing trains today, they come out to roughly, and I'm averaging, they come out to roughly $12.4 million per train. So multiply that by 2 new trains, it gets you close to that 25.4 million. There are some variances depending on the number of miles and layovers, etc. So that's the biggest portion of the $50 million. Talked earlier about that reclassification of the VRE access rate. So that's just moving that out of capital projects, but putting it into our operating budget because it's a maintenance item and not a capital project. Then also we included Western Rail. There's some maintenance costs because we're moving forward out there. There's some costs associated with running that. There's an access fee and then maintenance of way related to that purchase that we'll be talking about later today. And then another item I want to point out is the loss of federal credits. So in 22, there was $10.3 million of federal credits that help offset our costs. Basically, Amtrak applies it to the cost before they send us the bill. That total is going down by $5.9 million. in FY '23. I think there'll be $4.4 million in credits left, and we will exhaust those in FY '23. But that is, it shows up as an increase in our costs because there aren't as many federal dollars offsetting them. So those are the main items that should, point to the reason for the large increase. And I'll also say, I'll add here, just as I said, the revenue estimates before when I was comparing the amendment 22 to the approved budget, we were conservative. We took the same approach here with these new trains and with the normal operations. We want to be conservative with our revenue estimates because I think we all thought we were coming out of it this summer, and then Delta, now Omicron, and so the uncertainty is still there. And Amtrak really, they don't provide us those estimates for 23. They've given us an estimate for 22. And so we're just going to stick with that estimate as the estimate for 23. So moving on, the administrative budget does have about a $3 million, $3.5 million increase. And that's primarily the biggest item here is we are moving from 45 employees, from 34 employees up to 45. And probably the biggest thing is we hope to be at 34 by July 1st. When we started this July 1st for 22, we were at 4, maybe 5. Can't remember the date of one of our employees started. So 34 people starting the beginning of the year compared to 4 or 5. So that's what's driving that large payroll increase. And other than that, I think we're looking year over year, pretty much the same, similar costs that we will. By December of next year, we plan to go live with, or this year now, we plan to go live with the ERP system. So a little bit of an increase there for that. The other employee costs are travel expenses, training, recruitment expenses, and then just our other administrative costs. And as we bring on more employees, obviously those costs are going to increase. Next slide. And I'm not going to go into much detail here. This is really, as I mentioned earlier, the by train. Right now, we have by route data from Amtrak. So we're working with them to require our annual operating agreement with them that they provide by train data. And we will report it by route. This starting in 22 with this budget amendment and in 23. So we're going to report against these budget amounts. But hopefully, I just want to say we are going to push it down to where instead of grouping some of the trains together by route, we're going to get you by train data. Not just for you, but for us too, to be able to actively look at each train and see if slight tweaks need to be made to the service. Next
Steve,
slide. Yes.
can I interrupt a minute? And we talked about this a little bit when you all were walking me through it, but I just want to say for the record to thank you and your team and Shannon and everyone involved in the granularity of this budget compared to the last budget that we were able to see, because this is, while I know you're not quite where you want to be in terms of the train by train analysis, being able to break down revenues and expenses as opposed to having one number that says net and having really no good idea of what elements comprise that. This is a huge improvement. So I want to thank all of you for getting us this far and support whatever you can do to get us working with Amtrak to get to the train by train.
Appreciate it. And I think I mentioned earlier, while we're doing an amendment, that's another good reason. I think the reality of it is we just have better data, and better data helps y'all manage us, helps us manage the business. So next slide, please. So this slide, as Shannon detailed earlier, we have to tell you how we're paying for everything. So for the 22 amendment and the 23 operating budget, You see passenger ticket revenue being, about 51% for FY '23. And then the remainder comes from our VPRA fund, our dedicated Commonwealth Rail funds. As Jennifer kicked off the meeting and said that we did get some good news there earlier in December. So that's how these are funded. And then also we thought it prudent to put those federal credits because the federal credits are, in a way, they don't flow through us, and in a way they sort of net our cost a little bit and make a comparative year over year a little. You have to make sure you're adding those back in to really do a good comparison. So just wanted to mention those items on the funding. And moving on, so before I jump into this, that really, we kind of gone through the three sections of the budget. I don't know if there are any further questions before I keep going.
So essentially their box recovery is 54.2 for fiscal 22 and then 62.7. Is that their box recovery for operation? That's pretty good.
Yeah. Yes.
You don't think that's too
was,
optimistic?
well, the 51% is what for 23,
Right.
and then the 54.2, as I was saying, Shane, you really probably have to compare the 54.2 and add back that federal credit. But still, 54.2 out of 82.6. That's good for what we've gone through.
Right.
I think as an agency, Mike and his team and DJ can jump in, but I think you're very happy with the recovery of the ridership. I think it's coming back very strong this summer and got back to 70%. Then the variance hit, but I think we're back, kind of plateaued a little, but we're back and we didn't see a decrease. And so we're at that 70% range, and we hope we get through this, wearing these masks and get through all the variants, maybe, that things won't even take back. I mean, so compared to some other modes, I'm very optimistic of where we are. All right, well, the next item I wanted to talk to you about was, and really, this is, I want to make sure it's clear, this is a board reserve. I know it's city management, but so it's not our reserve, it's y'all's reserve. And what this is, so all of the capital projects, the $4.1 billion capital projects that Shannon took y'all through, they all have contingency in those project budgets. So there's been a risk analysis done at a certain level of added budget for those risks. And what we're looking at here is to provide you with a reserve. So if there is something that is completely outside of what could have been, planned for within a project budget. So if you hit some sort of waste product that just could not have been anticipated, and we have to come back and there's going to be added expense. And I think as much as that, I like to think about this as really it's a reserve for y'all for opportunities. So if the next Western Rail Corridor program comes along, there is some funding that you would have set aside for such opportunities. So I think that's the main point of this. The funding, as we did the financial modeling, and we probably run that model at least 5 or 6 times. Shannon now is very familiar with it. And in fact, we've been able to take the model in-house from the consultants so that we can now, when we just have a small change, we can push that through. Anyway, after the new revenues and all the other adjustments, but anyway, all the modeling, there's about $50 million in the next 4 years that we could put towards a board reserve, board management reserve. And so we would like to, in FY '23, as part of this proposed budget, to recommend $15 million being put in what we'll call a board reserve. So, and then the last thing on this slide is, we call it a metric, but it's really, at some point, we're thinking, how do we define what the proper amount is that should be in the reserve? Should it be 10, I'm just throwing something out. Should it be 10% of our total capital projects, $4.1 million? So should it be $410 million? Should it be 5%? And so when we talk about a metric, it's not really a performance metric. It's really more of how do we, or how do you as a board, and we as a company, how do we want to think about a reserve, this reserve from a long-term perspective, and what would we like to get that reserve balance to be? And there's a second, there's another way of looking at it is maybe it's on an annual basis. Like, what are we going to spend in the next year and a percentage of that?
So then Sharon, did you have a question? This is sort of not exactly a contingency reserve because those would be built into the projects. So this is an addition to that. And so this would be, part of what the board could decide, an enhancement or something. Is that?
Exactly. So if a member comes to us and says, hey, we're abandoning this line and we may want to purchase it for the future, maybe for trail, maybe for free passenger service, we don't have to run around for money. We have the opportunity to come to the board and say, look, this is presented to us. We think this is a valuable idea. Here's what it can do for us in the future. We have a reserve that you all can allocate to this. It's really just for that, for opportunities that we don't know about now. And let's just back up a little. It's also for, these are very big projects and they all have significant contingency, but we don't know what we don't.
Right.
And anybody that's watched these projects, you can run into butterflies that cost $10 million to mitigate because you've got to have a park right along the right of way. I mean, these things happen. And we don't have funds for parks. So it's just, it's really just in case fund. So the board can say, yes, we think it's important for the community that you add this walkway or that you do this park. It was never part of any plan. So it's really covering a number of different what ifs.
That's pretty nice.
Yeah.
And DJ, I'll add that was, and you said it twice there, it's y'all's reserve. So we would, for us to utilize this, we've got to come get your approval of a separate action.
Well, I was just going to say, and applaud the development of a metric or some sort of a baseline. I would also argue that at this point anyway, it's probably premature to decide how to do that, and experience will begin to inform on an annual basis how we start to develop that number. So right now, it's okay that we don't have the exact formula.
It's a strong reason why we're not proposing.
Right. That's right.
All right, so moving along, did want to just touch base real quick on the revenues. Jennifer stole the thunder here a little bit. So we did get some good news. And the bullet point here is looking at the latest revenue estimate that we had compared to the one that came out in December. So that's what the 75.1 million is. But if you actually look back at last year's approved budget and compare to the revenues we showed in there, it is $179 million increase. So from December of last year to December of this year, roughly $180 million increase. So some very good news there. And I'm not the state's chief economist, but I think as we, with our passenger ticket revenues, we're very conservative. I think maybe when COVID first started, no one really knew where we were going and how it would turn out. And so I think there was a lot of conservative approach. So, but for us, very good news. Next slide, and these next two slides are really summary information. So of the capital projects and operating grants, I'm just trying to leave you with the key changes that have occurred. So the addition of the Western Rail Corridor, about 210 million. This is capital projects, 210 million. And then on the grant side, about $168 million there. So y'all had, I believe we had talked to y'all last year in the spring about the Western Rail Initiative. We briefed you on it, but until we knew we were actually going to get to sign that deal with Norfolk Southern, we didn't want to actually put it in the budget, and we're there. One of the big drivers for the amendment. The other thing is the alignment of the I-95 corridor capital program with the comprehensive rail agreement that we did sign with CSX. So that's about $148 million of cost, which in that 148, and Shannon said this earlier, there was 38 million of transaction costs. A lot of that seems like a big number. A lot of that, $20 million of that is survey work. There are a lot of different, got to go to every county, every city, and every jurisdiction looking at the different boundary lines. And when you're dealing with railroads that records go back 100 years or more, it can take a lot of effort to get through that.
We literally have land records that were lost in courthouses that burned down in the Civil War. So it's been, the title and mark has been, and it's a huge, it's over 300 miles of, when we add also the Western Railroad of title, so it's quite a lot.
It's the S line and the Buckingham branch, as well as the I-95 from Petersburg to the project. So that's that. And then we also, I wanted to make a point, third bullet here, the 24.6 million that Shannon mentioned of capital grants. Those are new capital grants that are being proposed to do as a board. They are for the positive train control, which Amtrak did the work, and we have a lot better idea now of the potential costs than we did a year ago. And then in addition to that, we also, you remember, we did some work on an amendment for station state of good repair. And part of that, we said last May, we're still looking at it, and once again, we have better information there. And I will say, with respect to that station state of good repair, we do plan to try to seek some federal funding to help offset some of those costs. And the last thing, as Shannon mentioned, we added the DRPT managed grants. And honestly, we should have had them in there last year. It's just an oversight, and but those expenses, those dollars are flowing through our financial system, so they need to be in our budget. Next slide. And this is just a summary of the operations budgets we talked about. I'll just go through this quickly. So 22 approved to the amendment is a $33 million decrease. The federal credits, 10.3 million of that. The 2 new trains that didn't start will start in 23, 8.2 million. And then we did have a slight increase in our administrative budget, and then the difference being the revenues. The FY22 proposed amendment to the FY23 proposed budget. We are having a $41.9 million increase, and we're losing those federal credits for $5.9 million. The new trains, $25 million. And then we had $15.1 million of maintenance away and additional access fees that are offset by about $8 or $9 million of new revenue. And then, as we just talked about, the increase in our admin budget of $3.6 million. And the last slide is really just our next steps. And this is sort of set up for FY23. So I'll talk through that real quick. So presenting the budget today, come back February 1st, hope to get y'all's approval to move the budget forward, because on February 1, we're supposed to provide the budget to the CTB. Come back in the middle of February, present the budget to the Commonwealth Transportation Board. I'm hoping to get their approval moved up this year to April instead of May, in case there is any sort of amendment or any sort of questions, so we'll have a little more time. And then that would put us back May to get the final approval for the budget. And then that's not on this slide, but also the hope is to go to the board later today and present a resolution to get the amendment to the FY 22 budget done today, so that when we present you our December data, we can actually present that on using this new budget. So that's the hope, and I'm hopeful that we've taken y'all through this and that I will be asked that y'all will be able to support it. That concludes the budget discussion. I don't know if there are other questions.
So I believe, do we need to take an action to forward this to the full board for review?
I think you know, so
Would it be more effective if we took an action?
Yeah.
In support and then
Voted to recommend.
voted to recommend to the full board, yeah.
Exactly.
I'll be happy to make that motion.
Okay. Is there a second?
Happy to second that motion.
Okay, all in favor? Okay. Any opposed? No. Great. Good. So we will then bring that to the full board in the full meeting. Again, as you may recall, we originally were planning to have this meeting in early December. But then with the governor's budget, we knew there was going to be new information. We ended up having to postpone that. And then with the weather last week, we're not planning to have to do this on the same day as it going to the full board. But I think this recommendation will at least allow the board to now consider the full FY 22 amendment. So, and since we now have a quorum also, I would like to ask for a motion for approval of the minutes.
So moved.
Okay, is there a second?
Second.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Okay, great. Okay, so, thank you, Steve and Shannon, for the presentation on the budget items. And since we do not have our auditor who's going in attendance today, that takes one thing off the agenda, another thing off the agenda. But we did want to get back to you all related to the discussion we had in the full board, our last meeting related to the investment policy. And Steve's going to give us an update on where we are with that.
and actually we have Joe joining us through WebEx.
Okay.
But before I jump in there, I didn't know Madam Chair, for the FY 23
Oh.
budget, should we have the finance committee, not, should y'all vote since this meeting's being held, or recommend it, or,
Yeah, we can go ahead and do that, take an action to recommend the FY 23 budget.
I'm not sure, the point I guess I'm getting is, I'm not sure there's going to be another finance and audit committee meeting before the February 1 board meeting.
Okay. So,
For clarity though, there's no intention to bring the 23 budget to the full board today for approval.
yes,
It's just for common awareness. We'll hopefully bring it for approval in February.
If there are any questions or concerns, please feel free after this meeting at any time to get back.
so why don't we take an action then for the finance committee to recommend the FY 23 budget for consideration to the full board as well.
Happy to do it.
So moved, okay, second. All right, all in favor?
Aye.
Great. Okay, thank you.
So I'm not sure how the WebEx works, but I'll just sort of tee this up. So, we had a discussion, got an investment policy approved, and there was discussion around the ESG principles that, really, we said we would consider it whenever making investment decisions. And so the point that was made in the board meeting and understood clearly was needed a little more well-defined than that, what we will do with respect to incorporating the environmental, social, and governance principles within our investment practices. So we have been working since that investment policy. We've been working with Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo, between September and December, they spun off their investment management business into a company called Allspring. And so because of that, we haven't begun yet making investments with that firm. But we have been working with them in the interim on how do they look at ESG within their investment practices. And it turns out they actually do have an ESG scoring process. They actually have analysts on staff that's actually all they do. So I'm going to let Frank come on here in a moment and talk y'all through that. And then the other thing Frank's going to talk to y'all about, that gentleman's name is Frank Marchione from Ball Spring, is we also are looking at the investment policy. There may be some slight changes that are needed to allow us to achieve a better return. And what we were looking at is some of the ratings on corporate bonds and commercial paper. Maybe look at softening the rating requirement there. And then the other item to look at and consider is the inclusion of other policies, of other investment types, which are sovereigns, which are government securities of foreign countries, and then also potentially asset-backed securities. And what I'll say on that last point is I'm going to compare to several, Northern Virginia Transportation Authority has a large cash balance and they have large investment balance. So I'm going to make sure where we end up, we're going to be going to compare it, I guess, is the way to say it, to them. And then HR TAC, Road Transportation Accountability Commission, also has a very large balance in funds that are invested in. So when we make these proposals, I guess I'm committing to y'all that I'm compared to other entities within the Commonwealth to make sure we aren't going beyond what is reasonable. So with that, I don't know, Haley, if we got Frank.
Frank, can you make him full screen? So I don't think there's a presentation. Yes.
First of all, can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Oh, okay, excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much. And yeah, thank you for having me here today. I really appreciate that. And slightly belated Happy New Year to all of you. I know the meeting last week got postponed because of the heavy snows, but we're back here today, which is great. And as Steve mentioned, I've been working with him for quite a while on the investment policy considerations for the VPRA. And I'd like to address a couple of things that Steve mentioned. First of all is the notion of ESG investing. We as a firm have been taking ESG investing very seriously for a very long time. In fact, we were one of the original signatories to the United Nations Socially Responsible Investment Thesis. And we continue to, pursue that methodology on behalf of our clients. And to affect that, we have a very large proprietary set of research teams, both for equity investments and fixed income investments. Obviously, this is all oriented toward our fixed income teams. And we've developed a proprietary model that we call ESG IQ, which is, obviously ESG and then, investment quotient. And so we apply actually a score to every one of the issuers in the marketplace. It's a rating scale from 1 to 5, and 5 being the best. And what that does is there's 2 components to it. There are other providers of ESG scoring out in the marketplace, 4 or 5 very large notable ones. And we have a patent pending algorithm that actually takes all of that information and consolidates it into something meaningful for us. And then also our analysts apply both a quantitative and a qualitative score to all the issuers out in the marketplace. And all of that is combined to affect this score from 1 to 5. And then within each one of those 1 through 5, there's also sort of a stable, improving, or deteriorating, plus, minus, or stable rating to it, just like, S&P and Moody's does for corporate bonds. And we have the ability to, within a client's investment policy, mandate a minimum average for the portfolio or a minimum average ESG score for certain sectors of the portfolio. Certainly relative to this investment policy, as you know, there's you already have significant restrictions on corporate bonds and other corporate exposure like commercial paper, where you had an A1, P1 for commercial paper, AA and above for corporate bonds. And just as informational, the corporate bond market has evolved dramatically over the last, in my career, to the extent that, issuers in the AA and above space are dominated, and I can't even stress that word enough, dominated by financial companies like, banks, insurance companies, brokerage firms, so on and so forth. And so by having a AA above and an A1P1 on commercial paper and above rating, you almost by definition are going to have a significant concentration in finance and banking names if indeed you're in that market. And then of course the portfolio, this policy also has a restriction on the concentration of those sectors. Only 25% can be invested in corporate bonds. So the bottom line is, first of all, how that relates to ESG is that you are almost guaranteeing with the current investment policy that you will have a significantly high ESG score. Because finance companies and banks tend to rate very highly. I mean, they're not they're not drilling for oil, they're not burning, they're not mining for coal, they're not making guns, or other things like that can sometimes come up on other ESG scoring tables. So right now the policy is set up to have an extremely high ESG score, without really kind of doing anything to the investment policy. So there's that consideration right out of the gate. But if indeed this committee would entertain the opportunity to invest in lower rated corporate bonds, maybe in A and above, perhaps it would be time for us to consider some sort of formalization of an ESG score for the portfolio as a whole or for that sector. And of course, I'd be delighted to share as much information as anybody wants to read on this, how we look at that world, how we apply it to portfolios. It is extremely important.
Frank,
We lost you, Frank.
Frank, are you still there?
And so it's an open discussion at all times, and I'd be delighted to share information. Now, I've just said a lot of words. I'm going to shut up for a second and see if anybody has any questions or comments about what I just mentioned.
Well, Frank, we lost you for a moment, for I think about the last 15 to 20 seconds or so. Would you mind just repeating your last point there?
Oh, actually, the last 15 or 20 seconds was just regarding how we have the ability to, if indeed the committee is going to consider investing in lower than AA rated corporate bonds, then ESG becomes particularly relevant, and we'd be delighted to help you apply that methodology to the investment policy as well as the actual investment thesis, investing as well. And I said a whole lot of words and right now, and so I kind of want to shut up for a second to see if anybody has any questions or comments. I'd be delighted to help.
So Frank, when you have with your clients, is the ESG measure incorporated into the investment policy itself? Is that typically how it's been approached?
Yeah, well, I can't say typically that does happen. I mean, we certainly have clients who want that to be formalized and memorialized and embedded formally into their investment policy. And we'd be happy to help you with, the language around that and what makes sense for your organization in terms of how stringent and strict you want the ESG considerations to be. But other clients, they're a little bit more, I'm not going to say lax around it because that's not the right word, but a little less formal around it. They want us to keep our eye on that ball, and they want us to kind of just verbally report to them our methodology around it and where the exposure lies. So it kind of goes either way. I'd say, though, the trend is more and more clients are embedding it directly into their investment policy. It becomes more relevant, especially in the U.S. I hate to say this, but our European counterparts have been embedding it in investment policies for longer than we have. But certainly the trend is to have it embedded in investment policies directly, yes.
Okay. So I believe we would like to consider, I guess, modifications perhaps to the investment policy that would incorporate a ESG metric. And I think that's something that we'll need to also bring to our full board as well.
Yeah, Jennifer, I was going to say that what I had planned to do was, the ESG, obviously get that incorporated, but also look at those other modifications And as I said, compared to our peers in doing that. And my thought was, I don't know about February 1, I don't know if we'll be done at that point, but, and I don't know the next board meeting if it's in May. But it's that board to come back and get it formally, this ESG scoring process formally included. And also, we're going to tweak the investment policy and all as far as investment types and ratings, also do that then. And that would give us, this committee, another chance to have a meeting to go into the detail a little bit more. Because I know in reviewing their, they score across, they score within sectors. And obviously, if you're in the oil and natural gas sector, it's possible, an Exxon, I'm just making something up here, but an Exxon might score a 4 if you're just in that sector. And if you are across all sectors, and I think, so there's some detail that we put this in a policy, I think we want to be careful how we word it, that I would like to get back in front of y'all later. Maybe it's late March or early April before the next board meeting, so that then y'all can once again be comfortable with the proposed changes and be something that y'all can vote on first.
Steve, on this, I think it's important to make clear what Frank said on here. If we stay at double or above, we'll never get to Exxon, right? That's got to be made. So big changes. If I don't know if we're at single A, we're going to get to Exxon, but just that notion that except we're basically guaranteed if we stay in a current investment strategy to be ESG, extremely high ESG score. So I mean, we've got to talk about that, right? We can't be talking about this in a vacuum. There's no potential to invest in potentially risk. There's no chance of us buying guns. I mean, it's just not happening. So I think we need to talk about that. But if you do want to take it to single A, then it becomes relevant. But at double A, it's almost ingrained in the type of bank investments we can make. Is that entirely true though? Is it possible that you could have a high grade utility, for example, that would have at the corporate level double A ratings from some of the rating agencies? So I guess I'm just a little bit uncomfortable with the idea that while absolutely it will be mostly banks and investment companies that have those ratings, there are certain types of corporations with sustained dependable earnings that also have those types of ratings that we need. So rather than assuming that we will never get there if we unless we change our rate or our bond criteria,
No.
maybe we need to just understand better what, when you bring more a recommendation, what exactly is it we are we're agreeing to, and what are the ranges here of things that might happen within this umbrella that you're recommending?
He's talking about an average ESG score that's going to be really high, and I think it's also, does the board want to, that could allow an Exxon in there, and the average is still really high. And so I think
Exactly.
that's why I don't want to rush this and just throw something in there. I got to the loud clear September meeting that, we didn't want to just say, hey, we'll consider it, and by default, it will score high, but we also we absolutely do not want to allow it. We want to look within sectors, or we want to look across the board, and across the board, if a certain score is not met, we cannot buy that commercial paper, we cannot purchase those corporate notes.
Okay, so that's something to talk about with Brian too. Do we want to have it as a minimum average score, or do we want to have some absolutes we never touch?
Right. And I think that's, to me, the discussions, and I want to work with him and then get back with y'all. And like I say, maybe it's late March or early April, we have another finance committee meeting. We work through that. And you can all propose to the board whatever changes we think are best.
Okay. But it seems like it would have to necessarily be considered with the notion of the other changes you suggested in investment, right?
Yeah, exactly.
If we go down to something lower than double A.
Exactly.
Okay.
And to me, I think I don't want to, just like I don't want to amend the budget every year. I don't want to come back and keep amending the investment policy. I think it makes sense that, we did it, wanted to get it done, had time to think about it, and then incorporating this ESG scoring makes sense to me. At the same time, we've had time to also sit back and have a little more time to think about some things that we left out, some investment types we left out. Maybe we're just being a little too conservative. So I think it makes sense to come back and do any amendment all at once rather than piecemeal.
Jay, I wanted to give you an opportunity. I know you're here just to, listening in, but, I know this was something you brought up at the full board meeting, so I just wanted to see if you had any comments or questions.
Okay, thanks. I think your questions are kind of questions would have been. I will say what the main motivator I had putting something forward was around fossil fuels specifically, you know. I think the rest of the board began to think more broadly about ESG and that was what was to explore. So, Frank, this, you know, your capital embargo should be looking as my colleagues have said, at specifically what does it mean if all fossil fuel investments are limited? How does that work? How would it work? And the second one would be this broader ESG rating. What exactly does with that as it's currently? That's sort of what I.
Okay. So Steve, I think it sounds like we'd like to get some, more information. I think it would be helpful to get more information about the ESG metric, but also perhaps some, potential revisions to the investment policy as well. And I think, we'll need to have further discussion about, whether, again, there are classifications of investments we just want to avoid, such as fossil fuel.
I think it's wise to plan at another meeting, give us time to get detail, to make a proposal to y'all, and then take you through that proposal, answer any questions before we go amend. That's, I think, the best approach for it.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Frank. We, look forward to working with ESG metrics.
Yeah, absolutely, my pleasure. And as I just wanted to close by saying that that we, like I said, we had been on board with socially responsible investing since almost practically the beginning of that, the advent of that. And we understand how important it is for many different respects, including as a fiduciary on behalf of our clients' assets and investing prudently on their behalf. You know, there is indeed, we believe, a strong financial consideration for ESG investing, not just the quote unquote sort of feel good factor of it and the quote unquote right thing factor to do, but literally the financial impact of being able to invest our clients' funds, particularly in portfolios where capital preservation and liquidity are the primary objectives. I mean, the last thing you want is an ESG surprise to impair the financials of the security that you hold. So I'm looking forward to working with you guys, and thanks so much for having me today.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks, Frank.
Okay, so with that, we've gone through the agenda, and I know we've got the board meeting starting in a few minutes, and so we can go ahead and adjourn. All right, thank you.
Thank you.